Well, it appears to be Q&A time again. I'm Ian McCollum. Thanks for tuning in to another video on forgotten weapons. I have, as usual, 3 pages here of questions from the fantastic folks who support forgotten weapons. We have 2, actually, today from supporters on Utreon, and the remainder come from Patreon, so a big thanks to everyone there. Now, let's dig right in. Our first question is from NRF, who says, with how large the catalog of forgotten weapons has gotten, are there any weapons you wish you could get another shot at doing a video on? Maybe simply because of advances in sound and video, or even where you look back and you think maybe there was something that you could have done differently in the video. As a general rule, no. This is something that I have looked at. And in general, when I go back and check out older videos that I've done, sometimes much older videos, I generally come away pretty happy with the actual content of those videos. Yes, oftentimes the where I'm doing the video or some of the audio or visual stuff could be improved, but my focus is really on the informational content. And as long as like the up-close shots of the gun show you the details that are necessary, and as long as the information in the video is accurate, generally speaking, I have no particular need to go back and try to redo it. Now, I have edited, updated, corrected a handful of videos from time to time. One of the big ones was on the Drysa rifles. That was a couple years ago, I think, that I re-uploaded that one with some fixes to it. There were, at one time, there was a batch of guns that I really wanted another chance at because some of the very first videos that I did were from the collection of a guy named Bob Ferris, who had some just amazing firearms. The ones in particular, he had a ZK420S. That's the one that comes to mind immediately. Oh, and also ZH29. And I filmed those in absolutely terrible conditions with a horrible camera. Didn't know much about them at the time. And unfortunately, Mr. Ferris passed away many years ago, a number of years ago. But the silver lining to that was his guns ended up going up to auction, and I had a chance to refilm several of the ones that I really wanted to actually redo. So those were the guns that I wanted to redo, and I happily had a chance to. Well, happily and not, it'd be nicer if Bob Ferris were still around, because there's a lot of stuff I wish I could have asked him that I didn't, that I now can't ask him. So I'm probably going to end up getting a new camera at some point here fairly soon. I really ought to start filming in 4K at some point here, I think. So we'll probably do that, but I have no particular need to go back and refilm things in 4K that are in 1080 right now, because I think for the purposes of this channel, the resolution doesn't really make a big difference. I just don't want it to get too far out of date. Our second question off of Utreon is from Matthias, who says, there is a difference between the MKB-42H and the STG-44 above the barrel and between the gas block and the front sight. The MKB has a tube that is not present on the Sturmgewehr. What purpose does that tube serve? That is a very good question. What they did with the Sturmgewehr is they actually got rid of the tube that goes all the way out to the front sight block and replaced it with just a pin, basically. That pin is there to be a stacking rod. Originally on the MKB, the Haenel MKBs, that was a gas expansion chamber, and gas came up out of the barrel through the gas port, and it would actually push against the gas piston and expand into that tube in front of the gas port that ran out to the front sight. And in theory, that makes the operation a little bit smoother. In practice, it really doesn't matter, and that's what they discovered, is it really doesn't matter, and so they got rid of it. It was that much less stuff to have to manufacture for the later iterations of the Sturmgewehr. Cam, we're now moving on to Patreon questions. Cam says, why are we still making rimmed shotgun cartridges rather than transitioning to rimless? I would say there are 2 major reasons. One is simply backwards compatibility. There are so many shotguns out there that a manufacturer would have a really tough uphill battle trying to introduce a new rimless shotgun cartridge that, by definition, wouldn't fit and work in any pre-existing shotguns. That cartridge or that family of cartridges has been so well standardized that it's going to be almost impossible to replace it, because what you're replacing it with really doesn't help very much. Doesn't improve on the current shotgun cartridges much at all in a practical sense. Now, the technological reason why we might want to continue using rimmed shotgun shells is because those existing shotguns include a lot of different chamber lengths. Historically going back, originally going back, we have things like 2.5-inch chambers. Those generally got lengthened for higher pressure shells a little bit later on, but even today we have, for example, 2 3/4-inch, and we have 3-inch Magnum shells, 3.5-inch shells. Having a rimmed case means that the cartridge headspace is on that rim, which is what allows you to have a 3.5-inch chambered Magnum shotgun and load anything that's shorter than that shell and fire it safely and effectively. So the rim on there really does do something helpful and practical and important. In theory, yeah, we could do rimless shotgun shells that headspace on the end of the case. That's going to preclude multiple case lengths in the same shotgun. Frankly, it's also going to put a much more significant burden on shot shell manufacturers of getting the overall length exactly right. And considering that they're doing this with the end of the hulls are polymer, that's going to be trickier to get exactly just right than metal cartridge cases that we use in rifles and pistols. So I don't see that rimmed cartridge going anywhere at all. The significant majority of shotguns are either single or double barreled guns, or they're pump action with tube magazines. The tube magazine does really just fine with the rimmed cartridge. Yeah, rimless would be a bit of an improvement in box magazines, but we haven't, there aren't enough box magazine fed shotguns to justify that kind of significant change to shot shell technology. Nicholas, cool question. What sketchy or tenuous lead/plan/trip turned out great and far exceeded expectations? That would probably have to be my trip to South Africa, which started as both, I don't know about sketchy, but it was definitely tenuous. That trip started when I met Tony Neofitu, who is a fantastic South African gun designer, and I ended up going to South Africa and spending a bunch of time with him looking at some really cool guns. We went to Denel, did some shooting in their test range, which was awesome. But that whole trip started, believe it or not, and this is almost too perfect to be believable, but that trip started in the historical French small arms display room of Les Invalides, the Paris Army Museum. I was there a bunch of years ago. I was in Paris at the time, and I wanted to see the museum. I think it was my second time being in the museum. And so I'm hanging out. There's one room in particular up there that has a whole bunch of early and experimental French small arms, Lebels and Berthier's, and some really cool World War I and World War II stuff. Well, mostly World War I and earlier. Anyway, I'm hanging out there, and a couple of people had recognized me, and I was chatting with someone about some of the various guns in there, and I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, there was this older guy who would occasionally look over, and I've since learned to recognize this. It's the look of, I think that's the Forgotten Weapons guy, but I'm not I'm not confident enough to actually go say something about it. And I noticed this a couple times, he'd be looking at me, and if I looked back, he'd look away. And eventually, he did actually come over and introduced himself and asked in this very recognizable South African accent if I was, in fact, the Forgotten Weapons guy. This happens more often to me when I'm talking. That's what triggered it, I think, is I was chatting with some other guy, a random other tourist, about the guns in the room. And Neofitu comes over, and it turns out he and his wife are on vacation from South Africa visiting the Paris Army Museum, and he recognized me and introduced himself, and I knew who he was from some of his firearms designs, and it was one of those things of, you should come out to South Africa. Well, I'd love to come out to South Africa. And that sort of arrangement never actually works out. Except in this case, it totally did. It was a little while later, but I did, in fact, arrange a trip with him, flew off to South Africa, and got a ton of really cool videos with him. And then I arranged visiting another collector in South Africa, and got a bunch of other videos at the same time. So that's definitely the most sort of tenuous, sketchy initial lead that led to a fantastic trip. Falling Steel asks, do you convert all of your personal firearms to lefty use? Safety, mag release, rifles, pistols, why or why not? As a general rule, I actually don't. The one thing that I do change whenever I'm able to, which is not all that often, is adding either left-handed or ambidextrous safeties to guns, because it's just generally really awkward to operate a right-handed safety as a left-hander. And that has more of an impact on handling, especially, and this applies mostly to guns that I would consider taking to competition, where that sort of thing makes a difference. I don't generally change out magazine releases because, frankly, it's just not that big a deal to me. I've gotten so used to using my left-hand index finger to hit pistol magazine releases that that's so ingrained that if I change the magazine release to proper left-handed, where I can use my thumb to do it, I pretty much inevitably forget about that on the odd pistols where that change is possible, and I end up trying to use my finger and then go, oh, right, I switched that, and it would have just been better to leave it stock set up for a right-hander. So slide releases are kind of the same thing. I don't make that much use of ambidextrous slide releases. So in general, if I can convert something to be ambidextrous, so it's usable from both sides, I like that. If it's a matter, especially magazine releases, from going righty only to left-handed only, I tend to just leave the guns alone. Let's see, next up, RGB, and actually I had a couple of people ask questions about this. 30 super carry equals 7.65 French long? So at SHOT Show, I had a chance to talk to Federal about 30 super carry, and I am going to be doing some videos on the cartridge, or a video on the cartridge, because I think it's pretty cool. What's interesting is, yes, essentially 30 super carry is 7.65 French long Magnum. Federal boosted the pressure level up on that cartridge, and they did it, you may see this, the pressure on 30 super carry is something like 45,000 or 52,000 psi. It's insanely high pressure, but the reason they did that was so that you can get a very high initial pressure spike to accelerate a projectile to get a reasonably good velocity out of a very short subcompact pistol barrel. It's not 52,000 psi, kind of like a rifle is, where that pressure is sustained over a bit longer period of time. It's there specifically to try and kick a bullet out of a very short barrel very quickly. And if you're not using a short barrel, there's no particular need to load the pressure that high. Anyway, essentially super carry it's 7.65 French long, but it's like a millimeter longer case. And it's not actually developed from the French cartridge. In fact, the guys who developed 30 super carry, as far as I can tell, had no prior knowledge or understanding of the 7.65 French cartridge. What they did is they came from a basis of, we want higher capacity. We have really good 30/32 caliber bullets these days that can expand very nicely, that get, effective levels of penetration. And if you're using a cartridge that's 30 or 32 caliber and essentially straight-walled, you can fit about 10% more ammunition in a given magazine compared to a cartridge that's 38 caliber or 36 caliber, which is 9mm. So yeah, they ended up essentially duplicating 7.65 French without knowing it or intending it, and then pushed the pressure up a bit to make it more competitive with 9mm parabellum. The original French cartridge was not trying to compete directly with 9mm. It was kind of what it was. 30 super carry, they're specifically trying to match the velocity of 9mm and match the ballistic gel penetration of 9mm. They essentially want to get as close as they possibly can to 9 parabellum performance with 10 or 20% more magazine capacity. Brian says, on pistol caliber long guns, initially submachine guns and now pistol caliber carbines, why are forward mounted magazines more prevalent than grip mounted? It's essentially because having the magazine in the grip puts a bunch of restrictions on your magazines. So for one thing, it means that your grip angle and your magazine feed angle have to be the same. If we look at some of the older submachine guns that have grip-mounted magazines, for example, the Czech SA-26 series or 23 series, in 7.62 Tokarev, that thing has a really long magazine in the grip, which makes the grip kind of uncomfortable. And in order to get the right feed angle, the grip is actually angled slightly forward in the gun, which is also kind of weird and awkward. And it's all because it's more important to get the feed system right than to make the most ergonomic possible grip. Especially with today's pistol caliber carbines, I don't think the market would really accept that. The consumer market has gotten really used to especially interchangeable grips, get the exact, every little nuance of the grip just right or completely customizable. And the moment you go and combine that with a magazine, you're throwing all of that ergonomics completely out the window. Combine that with the barrels in pistol caliber submachine guns and carbines are generally relatively short. The only reason we see PCCs with 16-inch barrels is because of legal minimum lengths. In terms of ballistics, there's absolutely no need for a 9mm parabellum barrel to be 16 inches long. And so adding a little bit extra length to the gun, and here we'd be talking more about the older submachine guns, isn't really that big a deal because your barrel's only going to be 6 or 8 or maybe 10 inches long anyway, so you still have a pretty compact gun even if the magazine's moved forward. And by moving that magazine forward, now you can use things like drums. A whole bunch of different guns used drum magazines. You can use, if you're using a cartridge like 7.62 Tokarev, where you really want to have a curve to the magazine, you can do that and not be trying to have a really, really awkward grip by making it big enough to accommodate a curved magazine. If you wanted quad stack mags, you can do that. It just really makes the gun simpler and easier to build without having a lot of downsides. So that's more or less it, especially when you get to telescoping bolt mechanisms where you can put most of the bolt forward of the magazine well anyway. Your overall length concerns really kind of go down. Having the magazine well forward also then allows you to have a longer receiver tube, which means you have more bolt travel, which means you can make the thing softer shooting, eliminate that impact of the bolt on the back of the receiver at every shot. It is a better system to have the magazine mounted forward than to try and squish it into the grip in all but a very few slight circumstances. Next page. If I can turn the pages there. All right. Frank says, many pistols both cock and release the striker when the trigger is pulled. Has this feature ever appeared on a rifle? If not, why is it such a common feature on pistols? So essentially what we're talking about is a double action rifle. Not strictly speaking, but the idea being in a handgun, the striker is not fully tensioned, and pulling the trigger pulls the striker back the rest of the way and then releases it. Glock is the classic example of this. I'm sure there is a rifle out there somewhere that has done it. I believe it was Mossberg came up with a version of the 590 that had a trigger that approximated, that felt like a double action revolver trigger, although it didn't actually have this change in functionality. The reason that we see that in pistols is because of safety concerns, because a pistol is intended to be immediately, it has to go from being safe to carry to immediately operable in as short a time as possible. Rifles generally don't have that restriction. There's space on a rifle for a nice big manual safety, and people generally don't expect a rifle to be, like a 1 second or 1.5 second draw to first shot on a rifle, because you're not carrying a rifle in a ready condition in your pants or in a holster like that. So there's space for more significant safeties, and you don't really need that immediate rapid transition from safe carry to firing on a rifle. Mikhail says, if revolvers and self-loading pistols were not available or even not invented, what would you carry? I.e., what designs do you think is the least impractical between the various derringers, manual repeaters? He brings up the Kopp Derringer, the Brownie, the Reform pistol, the Semmerling, the Lancaster, the Schulhoff, the Bittner, etc. So, okay, interesting question. No revolvers and no semi-autos. That leaves Derringer type guns, typically single shot. It leaves pepperbox style of guns where you have multiple barrels. The Reform is also a multiple barrel gun. The Lancaster is a multiple barrel gun. Or manual repeaters. Well, I would probably not carry a manual repeater. those guns are all pretty darn impractical to actually shoot. They're really quite awkward. Some of them, like the Bittner, look fantastic, but the development of that line of handguns pretty much ended by 1900 because self-loaders became feasible and far better in every practical way. I would probably go with a multi-barrel pepperbox style of gun, or Derringer style of gun. Something like 4 barrels is probably a decent compromise. The Cop, 4-barrel Cop 357 would be it's a decent gun in concept, except it's terrible in execution. The trigger's awful. The barrel regulation is terrible. Something like that would probably be my choice. You might be able to do 3 barrels in a very flat, compact design, even with a fairly modern cartridge. That could be feasible. You could probably come up with a 3-barrel, like 3 vertical barrels that would be nice and flat to carry, and design them with a clip system so that you could reload all 3 in one movement. That's not a terrible system. That would probably be my choice. Now, he does also bring up Semmerling, which is one of the interesting, it's essentially a semi-auto pistol without the semi-auto bit, where you manually rack the slide with each shot. There aren't a lot of examples out there like that besides the Semmerling, and I'm not a huge fan of the Semmerling. Yeah, I think I'd stick with like a 3-barrel flat deal. Nathaniel asks, what is the future of economically affordable handguns? We've seen the advances in mid to high-end handguns, but not everyone can afford an Alien. I think, Nathaniel, this is, I'm not sure that this question is based on sound premises, because we have probably some of the most affordable, highest quality handguns in all of history. What you can get for just a couple $100s today, I think is very much competitive with the cheapest handguns that have always been available. I think you can get a better quality gun for less money, accounting for inflation and differences in currencies, than you used to be able to. If we look at, for example, if you take a gold standard to equate handgun designs, if you look at the Old West, a good quality Colt revolver would cost you $20, a $20 gold piece, more or less, which was kind of close to a month's wages. Today, that gold piece is worth, what, $1,500 to $2,000, depending? I haven't gone and looked at the market recently. And for that money, you could get 3 really good, modern, law enforcement quality semi-auto pistols. You can go get 3 Glocks for $500 or $600 a piece. You can get, there are Taurus pistols out there for substantially less than that. There are military surplus pistols out there for, well, the surplus has kind of dried up a bit, but for a long time you could get a Makarov for very little money, relatively speaking, and that was a really quite good handgun. So I think we, in fact, have some of the best availability of economical, affordable, self-defense style of handguns today than as we ever have in history. Andrew asks, why were over and under folding stocks more prevalent than side folding stocks? And this is another question that I'm not sure is really based on sound premises, because I don't think that over and under folders were more prevalent than side folding stocks. They definitely aren't today. I think there was a period when over and under folding stocks made more sense. A lot of that is based on the use of optics today. Top folding stocks just don't play well with optics. That wasn't an issue, say, in the 1940s with submachine guns, but it is an issue today. Top and bottom folding stocks can tend to be very compact because they don't add bulk to the side of the gun. At the same time, they require more of a compromise in the stock itself. So most top and bottom folding stocks are a lot less comfortable than side folding stocks. I think that's why we've seen a large transition to side folders. The combination of they work well with optics and they make for better, more ergonomic stocks, because you can put the hinge right up at the front and then have a totally standard full form stock that just folds up on the side of the gun. With a top folder, you generally have to bridge the width of the action, and you end up with things like the AK underfolder, the MP40 folding stocks, where you got two metal braces that are really pretty far apart and kind of stick out. They have to stick out a little bit wider than the side of the gun, which makes them a bit uncomfortable. But in general, it's a set of compromises that has gone kind of both ways with equal frequency, as far as I can think of. Landrick asks, what impact did the advent of armor, tanks, have on small arms development during World War I? Did the Puteaux SA-18 37mm cannon see use by infantry? So kind of two separate questions here. What impact did armor have on small arms? Absolutely, had a significant one. We can immediately see Germany developing the Mauser Tankgewehr rifles. They developed a 13.2 millimeter cartridge in large part for anti-tank use. It was also intended for anti-aircraft use. Germany was in the process of developing the Tank und Flieger machine gun, which was kind of going to be their equivalent of US M2. It was a 13 millimeter machine gun intended specifically to take on both tanks and aircraft. Aircraft, because bigger projectile is able to do a little more damage to those vehicles when you manage to get a hit, which is fire a lot of volume at a moving aircraft and only get a couple of hits, maximize the damage you can do. By the end of World War I, planes are starting to become a bit armored, and it was valuable to have a larger projectile to shoot at them. But then tanks were a very significant threat to German infantry, and they were immediately trying to counter it. What they ended up using, they had the Tankgewehrs, which were of moderate utility. They tended to use our direct fire field guns on British and French and American tanks instead, and that was pretty effective. But those are not really man-portable guns. It's hard to have those organic to an infantry squad. Now, bringing up the Puteaux 37mm cannons is not quite the same thing. Germany, for all practical purposes, did not have tanks in World War I. Yeah, they built between a dozen and 20. They saw very little service. The German tanks really didn't have any direct impact on Allied small arms development because German tanks never showed up. Those 37mm Puteaux cannons were intended to be used on field fortifications, machine gun nests, bunkers. That was the purpose of that cannon. It was to have light firepower organic to the infantry. They could be moved up to close range in tight quarters and attack strong points like those. Now, that would have been a fantastic gun to use on German tanks had there been any German tanks, but there weren't. After World War I, we do see further development of heavier machine guns. The US 50 cal certainly becomes a common thing, and that's going to be used for anti-tank use. The British develop a 50 caliber Vickers. A lot of these things don't, the US 50 caliber makes the transition to World War II very well. Some of the others don't so much, and you see anti-tank guns become the predominant infantry anti-tank weapon as tanks evolve past their vulnerability to anti-tank rifles. Anyway, I'm getting well beyond World War I here, which is the focus of the question. So, moving on to our next question. Inceptor says, have you ever seen the TV series Tales of the Gun? It was a show airing on the History Channel that spanned 52 episodes that talked about guns in history, whether it be what outlaws used, primary weapons of an army, what a specific military branch used, very in-depth for the time. If you've seen it, what is your opinion on the show, and do you think its format is a good entryway for newcomers into firearms history? I have seen them, although it's been a long time since I watched any of them. My father was actually interviewed on one of them. There was a Tales of the Gun about Japanese small arms, and my father is one of the people that they interviewed for that. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, I've been aware of the show since it came out because of that. Today, I think Tales of the Gun, a lot of its subjects, they leave a lot of depth to be desired. They are really overview programs. That said, I think they're a great entryway for people who are just starting to become interested in firearms history. I think the show was pretty well done for its time. It's one of those cool shows from the period when the History Channel was actually about history, before it became all about Hitler, and then became all about ancient aliens and stupid reality shows. I am told, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, that Tales of the Gun is actually the leading, it's the show that sold more DVD copies for the History Channel than any other show they ever did. So clearly it was popular with viewers as well. And yeah, you don't want to go write, your thesis based on a Tales of the Gun episode, but if for an introductory thing available on cable TV, it was really quite good. And frankly, there hasn't been much, there's certainly the potential to do something far better than Tales of the Gun, but as far as I can tell, really no one's even matched the quality of Tales of the Gun on general purpose television. Ready, Fire, Aim says, you took the Wayback Machine 20 years to 2002. It's your birthday, and your rich aunt gives you $100,000 that can only be spent on firearms. How terrible. Being from the future, you know exactly what to buy, but the catch is you can't sell anything for 20 years. What would you have bought to keep, and what would you now sell in 2022 to cash in and get rich? That's an interesting, fun question. So one of the things I would try to buy would be a MAT 49, because I'd love to have one, and they've gotten stupidly expensive. They would have been stupidly expensive, relatively speaking, in 2002 as well, but less so now and perhaps easier to find than they are now. So I'd probably pick up one of those to keep. But the more interesting question to me is, what are the guns, what are the categories of guns that have grown the most in value since 2002? Kind of as a direct rebuke to my general investing advice of don't invest in guns. Well, it's easy to invest in things with hindsight of a hypothetical time machine. On the one hand, I think one of the areas that has grown the most in value recently are like the pre-89 modern semi-auto military small arms. So guns like the FAMAS that were semi-auto only factory copies of guns in current military service that came in. And importation of that stuff basically ended in the late 80s with the various assault weapon import bans, which are still on the books today. We had a domestic manufacturing ban that went into place in 1994, but it sunsetted and ended in 2004 and is no longer of any relevance. But there was that period in the very late 70s and then the early and mid 80s when you had guns like the FAMAS, G3s, although G3s date back a little bit earlier as well, the proper original Israeli Galils, actual FN-made FALs, a bunch of these relatively modern military rifles. I would probably try to get a lot of those. Now, 2002 is a bad time to be doing it because the assault weapons ban is still in place. Those are all pre-ban guns, so they were grandfathered in, and so their desirability rose artificially between 94 and 2004. You'd probably be better off trying to buy some of those guns in 2005 when domestic manufacture becomes legal again and it takes some of the price pressure off of the high-end foreign import pre-ban guns. But some of those things have gone to just astronomical levels today. I saw Sig Manurin 540 sell for $30,000. FAMASs are $30,000 or $35,000. There are G3s, early import G3s are bringing $30,000 or $35,000. And some of the guns that are a little more common, things like the .308 caliber Galils, actual FN FALs, those things they're not at the $30,000 level yet, but they're going up in value a lot. So that would be a tempting group. One of the others might be some of the World War I era military surplus stuff that was underappreciated back then that would become a lot more interesting to a lot of people with the centenary of World War I. Labels are perhaps a fantastic example. Even when I was buying labels, which was 10 years ago, they were, I don't know, $400, something like that. Today, they're $2,000. Back in 2002, I don't know exactly what they were selling for, but would have been less than $400. That's one, the label in particular, is one that went up in value a lot for a variety of reasons. The centenary of World War I made them more interesting to people. People went back and went, oh, right, that's a thing. I didn't think about those. I ought to have one of those. There were legal changes in France that made them, until 2012, 8mm Lebel was restricted as a military cartridge in France, and so in order to legally have them as a category C or D gun in France, they had to be rechambered to something like 30. What was it? There's a variation on 384 Winchester or 348 Winchester. You had to rechamber them for a stupid artificial cartridge, and so a lot of people didn't rechamber them, but that meant that they had them off the books and illegally and underground. Well, in 2012, that law changed. You can now have 8mm Lebel rifles as just plain bolt-action rifles without further restriction. And so I think there was actually a significant amount of re-export of Lebels back to France, because a lot of them, a huge number of them, in fact, almost all of them, are legally antiques here in the US, which makes them super easy to export. So that dried up the supply and helped boost the prices as well. So some of the guns like that. I would focus on, if I was doing surplus, I would focus on quality, because the really high quality guns have more of a premium now than they did back then. So you can do a better job increasing your investment, increasing your value that way. I would definitely not buy commemoratives, because those are always worthless. Yeah. Probably your best bet would be to take that 100 grand, put it in, here we go, put it in the stock market until 2007, pull it out in 2007 and reinvest it into buying like pre-89 imported assault weapons, semi-auto assault weapons, and then resell those in 2022. That's probably your best way to maximize value in this case. Anyway, spent a long time on that one. Our next question is from Eric. This is a simple one. I have inherited some old guns lacking serial numbers. What do I have to do if I want to sell them? Obviously, this is a question specific to the United States. Prior to 1968, there was no requirement that firearms have serial numbers. Now, most of the good quality ones did, because it was important for manufacturers to track their production, to track quality control and all this sort of stuff. Obviously, military ones have had serial numbers forever for tracking again. But relatively inexpensive stuff, off-brand, department store brand 22s and shotguns in particular, didn't have to have a serial number, and so a lot of mid and low tier manufacturers didn't bother putting one on. Those are all grandfathered, essentially. There is no requirement to add a serial number to them. Any decent FFL who is buying or selling guns should be well aware of this. For an FFL, those get entered into a logbook with a serial number as NSN, or no serial number. ATF knows about it. Everybody in the industry knows that there is this whole class of guns that have no serial number. They don't need one. You don't need to do anything special if you want to sell it. If you have to record a serial number, it goes down as NSN, no serial number. Mikhaila says, what historical era is of most interest to you? When and where would you have liked to live? This might be a kind of boring answer, but my answer would be right here and right now, or possibly in the future. There's a lot of nostalgia out there that people have for various times in the past, and I don't tend to share that. There are cool aspects to a lot of different time periods, but I think if you actually look at the overall quality of life and what we have access to today in terms of information and technology, there is no period in history that I would rather live than right where we are now. And if I could skip forward a little bit, that could be pretty tempting, assuming we haven't destroyed the world in nuclear World War III. Northern Relish says, was there ever an automatic M1A1 Carbine variant? Like an M2A1, you might say. Seems to me like it would be the most versatile option and quite useful as a cheap but usable PDW for foreign aid or to equip advisors in places like Vietnam. No, there was never a full auto M2 or M1A1 carbine. Frankly, the M1A1 folding stocks are total crap and they're bordering on useless. They're really bad. They're very popular as a collectible today, but they were not particularly popular even with the guys who were using them back in the 40s. So the M2 essentially the M2 carbine came around after the end of production of the M1A1 carbines. There was only a limited number of M1A1s that were actually required. They were being made for paratroopers. If you were not a paratrooper, there was no need to have the carbine get shorter so that you could stuff it into a jump bag to jump out of an airplane with, and that gun was better with the stock in every conceivable way. And so the full auto ones, post-dating the production of paratrooper models, were all fixed stock guns, and frankly they should remain that way. It is the M2 carbine is of somewhat dubious use already, between its magazine reliability and its controllability. Like, it's not as uncontrollable of a gun as people think, but the value of a full auto M1 carbine is a little bit dubious, and it would be even much worse with a folding stock. 1911 McKinney says, "Hi Ian, I recently purchased a transferable 1919 A4. Very cool. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on using a 1919 in the modern role of a squad automatic weapon. With the Israeli bipod in stock, along with a 308 conversion and possibly an optics mount, it doesn't seem too terribly far out of line to me. I know it's pretty heavy, but assuming that's not a problem, do you think it's still a viable weapon in a modern context? If so, what attachments would you recommend, such as optics or ammo holders, kind of like the Stinger, obviously with no permanent modifications to the gun?" If you were to put this in a military context and not a collector's context today, I would say it is totally an obsolete, or at least obsolescent, setup for a squad automatic weapon. The problem is the Browning 1919 is massively too heavy and too bulky compared to all the other options in a belt-fed 308 available to a military force today. The 1919 A6 was the US's kludge to turn the 1919 into a squad automatic weapon, and it was awkward at best. Now, what you're talking about with the Israeli stock and bipod is that's the much more easily accessible version of the 1919 A6 to us today. The actual original A6s had a lot more modifications. The Israelis took a standard A4 and they stuck on a bipod that clamps around the barrel shroud, and they clamped on a sheet metal buttstock. But the original A6s actually had a much lighter profile barrel. They had a much lighter bipod that was actually, it was threaded in line with the barrel shroud. It was essentially part of the barrel shroud. And that made the gun a bit lighter and handier than an Israeli conversion type. I actually have a semi-auto 1919 with that exact same Israeli bipod and shoulder stock. And like, it's a fine gun as long as you don't actually have to move it. There is not really any good way to mount ammunition to the gun, certainly not without, like, there are no good products out there or adapters out there. It's kind of like the RP46 in that what you do is you just kind of put an ammo can right next to the gun, and your assistant gunner makes sure that it doesn't fall over and your ammo doesn't all get in the mud. Now, optics are a possibility. There is an optics mount on a lot of the 1919s, especially if you have an Israeli gun, it should have an optics mounting bracket on the side, and you can fabricate something to drop whatever sort of optic you want on there. Magnified is probably a stretch because you're probably not going to get a very good cheek weld with the Israeli stock, so something like a red dot is probably your best bet, some sort of reflex style sight mounted up on top of the, well, it's an L sort of dog leg optics mount that you would need. But no real good way to hold ammo on it. What it does have going for it is an excessively durable gun. It's a very reliable gun. It's easy to swap calibers. 308 conversion from Israel is the easiest. You can also pretty easily convert them to 8mm Mauser. That was really popular when 8mm Mauser surplus ammo was exceptionally cheap for a long time. I actually have an 8mm conversion in my own gun for that reason. In general, if I had a transferable 1919 A4 and I wanted to do something fun with it like that, I would probably be looking to mount it on a vehicle instead. I would fabricate a pintle mount for whatever the most technical-like vehicle I have is, ideally a Toyota 4x4, and put it up in there. I think that would be more fun than trying to convert it into a squad automatic weapon, which it really, really kind of isn't. Mickey Mouser, there's a nice transition. Mickey Mouser says, do you like cars? Speaking of Toyota 4x4s, if so, what are some of your favorite cars? I like the idea of cars, and it turns out I don't really like actually having or working on cars. I had, in fact, mostly a CJ2A Willys Jeep for a while. There's actually some video still out there on the net of me mounting my 1919 semi-auto to it, in fact. But I just don't enjoy working on cars, and I don't really enjoy driving either. To me, driving is simply a way to get from point A to point B, and I want to do it as easily and with as little fuss as possible. And so that Jeep, the idea, stupid simple things, but like the idea that the engine needs to warm up just bugged me. I like being, if I have to go somewhere, I want to get in the car, turn the key, and go, not let the engine warm up for 5 or 10 minutes first and fiddle with the choke to make sure that it's running right, and then be regularly having to tinker on it to maintain it. It wasn't a difficult vehicle to work on, it just turns out I don't like working on them. So there are a lot of cars that I think would be really cool to have, like a Volvo P1800 would be awesome. It'd be fun to have something like a 2CV just for kicks, but these are, for me, these are all essentially fantasies unless I get to the point where I'm like Jay Leno and I can just hire a garage and a mechanic to maintain all of these cool cars for me, so I can just pop down and pick one and go drive it and not have to deal with it ever. I don't anticipate that ever happening, but that's sort of my attitude towards cars. Like, what I need to do is find a good friend with a really cool car collection whose cars I can borrow from time to time. But that also hasn't happened yet. Straker says, could you expand on why you think the spinner is not a great stage target in competition? Sure. So let me preface this by saying that I think the spinner is a fantastic target to practice on because it trains 3 things all simultaneously: accuracy, visual acuity, and timing. You have to shoot the spinner at the right cadence, at the right time. You have to hit every shot. If you miss every 3rd shot on a spinner, you're never going to be very successful on it. And then it allows you to practice increasing your shot-to-shot time to the point where you can get doubles on spinner plates, again, at the right timing. So it is probably one of the very best. If you only have one target to practice on, a spinner is, to my mind, probably the best possible single target you could practice on. Because frankly, you can use it as a static plate and hit it once, but then you can also get all of these other benefits from practicing on it. What I feel like, the reason that I don't like the spinner in competition is, there are a couple of reasons. First off, it's a huge skill barrier. It's a binary style of target in that you can't like get half credit on a spinner. With a Texas Star, for example, where you've got 5 plates that fall off that rotate. As when you totally suck on a Texas Star, you will hit like 1, and then as soon as it starts moving, you can't get anything else. Well, you can gradually improve on a Texas Star and get more of the plates and faster, and in a competition setting, your score will improve incrementally as your skill gets better. On a spinner, your score is 0 until you get to the point where you're good enough to actually spin it, and then your score goes boop, straight up to 100%. And then there is a bit of an improvement as you're able to spin it faster. But in general, it's a very binary sort of target. I think it's especially harmful in competition if it's, say, at the beginning of a stage where everyone who isn't capable of spinning it is going to get penalties for the entire rest of the stage because of their inability to get that first target. The best, if you're going to use a spinner in competition, I think the best place is at the very end of a stage where failing to spin it has the least consequences. Because to me, it's a waste of a stage if a lot of your shooters aren't able to get past that first obstacle of the spinner. There are some a little bit more mundane practical problems with it. Spinner arms do come loose. It's hard to tell exactly when they come loose. From a match director's point of view, it's resetting, tightening down the spinner can be an awkward bit of reset. One of the nice things about a spinner in theory is that it doesn't require any reset. So you never have to account for sending someone downrange to reset the spinner. Well, if you occasionally have to do it to tighten the spinner, that can be awkward, especially if you want to put one at longer distance where it's really going to interrupt the flow of the stage if someone has to go down there and tighten it. And of course, determining when it needs to be tightened. Time of day can influence how difficult a spinner is. If you start a stage where it's in the morning and it's cold, that spinner is going to have more friction. As it warms up, it will have less friction. Yes, there is an element of tough luck. Like, everyone approaches this, there are pros and cons to every stage at every time of day, and so we don't care if it's not strictly 100% fair. But I think in general, having the target presentations be the same for everybody, the target difficulty be the same for everybody, is the goal that one should go towards. Well, that's the big thing. It's really that it is such a binary skill divider. I would prefer to have competition see targets where mid-level shooters will have scores that are that match their progression of skill more than the spinner. That said, I continue to practice on the spinner as much as I can myself, because next time I run into one in competition, would very much like to simply obliterate it immediately and not continue to be one of the people who is obstructed by not being able to get it all the time. Next question is Rainson, who says, video game firearms often come equipped with an electronic ammo counter that keeps track of how many bullets remain in the magazine. Do you think this has any value in the real world, or is it superfluous? Has anyone attempted to create something similar? Yes. In theory, it does have some value. There have been attempts to do it. There have been a couple of them more recently than electronically. They've all been fairly recent. Historically, there have been open windows on the side of magazines that have little tracking lines, and it's a famous example. The US military experimented with a version of the Luger that had an open window in the side of the magazine and an ammo counter on the grip, and you could just look at the gun and be like, I have 4 rounds left. I think the reason that they've never taken off very well, and we probably will see the electronic ones at some point. In fact, Magpul's has this new optics system that they had on display at SHOT Show this year that actually tracks ammunition capacity in a magazine and displays it in your optic, which is an improvement. The reason I think they haven't ever been all that popular is it's information that's only really useful if you can get it immediately. Essentially, if it can just keep you constantly aware of how many rounds are in the magazine. If you have to stop and look at something to find out, you kind of might as well just wait until the gun goes empty and then just reload. You don't lose that much more time by reloading than you do by trying to check the status of an ammunition tracking device. Or if it's a thing of like, I'm about to go around the corner into a room full of enemy soldiers, I should make sure my magazine's full. Well, you have the prerogative of when you go around that corner, so rather than looking at all, you can pull the magazine out and just check without having any fancy device, or just proactively load a full magazine instead, which might be the best option if it is an option. It's just when you have to look away at the side of the gun or the back of the gun, or refocus your attention to get that information, it's already taken long enough that it's not that important anymore. So what Magpul's looks to be doing now, where it's displayed in the scope, in the reticle of a rifle, that actually is a way where, assuming it works reliably, you are immediately and constantly aware of the ammunition capacity. And I could see that one having value. But that's the first of that style that I've seen. Even the ones where, like, there's a counter, someone did a Glock slide that had a counter mounted on the back of the slide. Even that, you have to refocus your attention from your targets to the back of your slide to get that information. And that just limits its practicality. 3 more questions here. We have Conrad says, will you be writing another book? And if so, do you have any ideas? Yes, we haven't formally announced it on the Headstamp website yet, but I am working on my next book. Even while Pistols of the Warlords continues to be in the somewhat interminable now printing process. Hopefully we'll have those out sooner. I really have no timetable for them right now, but they are in progress. At any rate, I am, in the meantime, working on my next book, which will be on finished small arms, which I'm very excited about and having a lot of fun writing, and it'll probably be 1 to 2 years before that book is ready and available, but it is coming. Eric says, I've been watching a lot of biathlon in this Olympics. What kind of action did those rifles use? The athletes use their trigger finger and thumb to run it. Biathlon rifles these days are all 22 rimfires, as is the current status of biathlon rules. Biathlon used to be full-power military rifles, interestingly. In fact, I'll link to it. I have an article that I wrote years ago on military patrol, which was sort of one of the early style of biathlon competitions in the Olympics. At any rate, today they're 22s and they use a toggle lock system. So manually operated, and the toggle comes out the side of the action, kind of perhaps like one of the Führer submachine guns or toggle action systems, but it's specifically designed so that the toggle lever is right in position for the athlete to use with a thumb and forefinger or just a forefinger without breaking their firing grip. And so that they can cycle that action as quickly as possible. The toggle allows them to have a relatively short throw to cycle a new round in, and that allows them to maintain shooting position, hit a target, toggle it, and move to the next target. The biathlon shooting is, I think, 5 targets basically next to each other in a row. And so the faster you can cycle that action without breaking your firing grip, the faster you will be able to engage all of the targets. At some point here, I will get my hands on some biathlon rifles and do some full video on them because it's a neat system. It's an interesting example of a system that is specifically adapted to that exact sport and its peculiarities. So we'll do that at some point, but we don't have a lot of biathlon here in Arizona, weirdly. And our final question comes from Ron. It says, considering the number of anti-aircraft guns that ended up being stuck on US warships in the Second World War, did anyone consider using the electrical power they had available to run electric Gatling guns? It seems like it would have saved a lot of space and weight up high where both were at a premium. Potentially. A lot of the anti-aircraft guns weren't mounted all that high up, so that's, I'm not sure, a big deal. I think the bigger issue is that, especially as the war progressed onward, larger caliber became very important. If you were going to down an enemy aircraft, you wanted to have the largest projectiles possible to ensure that a single hit would in fact destroy the aircraft. And if you want to look at, for example, Japanese kamikaze attacks, you couldn't, like, it wasn't enough to destroy the aircraft. You had to destroy it in such a way that it was going into the ocean out there, not the engine catches fire, the plane will never make it back to base, but it can still crash into your ship. Like that, if the plane crashes into your ship, you've lost, even if you technically destroyed it first. So larger and larger caliber anti-aircraft guns became very important. And I mean, you look at the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, the shells are like this long. That's still not something that we really have the capability to put into a rotary Gatling-style gun today. It's just not practical. And it definitely wasn't practical back in World War II either. So you could have had rotary guns. In fact, the Russians had some rotary aircraft guns like the Shikaz, but they're 30 caliber guns. It might have been possible to do that with 50 caliber in the 1940s, but 50 caliber for shipborne defense was too small. It didn't have the range and it didn't have the stopping power, and they wanted bigger stuff, at least 20mm. And those as rotary electrical guns simply hadn't been developed at that point. All right, and that is all of our questions for today. A big thanks to everyone on Utreon and Patreon whose contributions on a monthly basis support Forgotten Weapons every single day. If you want to get your question into a future Q&A video, please feel free to sign up and subscribe over at Utreon or Patreon. I'm also on Floatplane, although I don't take question requests over there because it's not really set up well to do it. And that's all I got. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.